Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're in California and on the West Coast. I'm Mark Skorka, President of Opera America, and welcome to our fourth and final session of our online 2020 annual conference. The title is Making Change. Recent racist violence required us to respond in this forum. In the aftermath of violence last week and this week, we just felt it was important to adjust the session topic so that we focused a little more intensely on how we bring racial justice to opera. In doing so, we are going to draw on some of the lessons of systemic change that have been learned in opera in other areas of the field and figure out how we can draw on some of those and other strategies to create the change we want to see. I want to thank the panelists who have agreed to adjust the session topic at the last minute, and to the new panelists who've joined the session with very short notice. They have done so with grace and generosity of spirit, for which I am truly, truly grateful. Let's remember that when we're talking about systemic racial injustice, it is extremely difficult for our colleagues of color to share with us about their own personal experiences and their suggestions for our field. We are honored, we are grateful to our colleagues for having the courage to join us and to speak openly and honestly in the course of the session today. As we've done in past sessions, especially last week, we will introduce definition of terms. If there's EDI terminology that comes up, you'll be able to look in the chat room and see some of the definitions, so that way we can move beyond the basic introductions. As usual, we also invite you to ask questions and to make comments in the chat room. We ask that you do so today with special respect for our panelists and for one another, for the different perspectives and opinions that will be expressed. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the panel going in alphabetical order. We have Darrell Acon, who's the Director of Engagement and Equity at Long Beach Opera. Aubrey Bergauer, who's the Founding Executive Director at the Center for Innovative Leadership and the Vice President for Strategic Communications at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Annie Burridge is the General Director and CEO at Austin Opera. Khori Dastoor is the General Director at Opera San Jose. Adrian Ellis, the Director of AEA Consulting, with special thanks for your wonderful pre-session presentation, Adrian. Quadizia Johnson, back with us for the second week in a row. She is our Education and Community Culture Manager at the Dallas Opera. Michael Maury, who's the General Director of Tapestry Opera. He's also the Chair of Opera CA in Toronto. Tracy Wilson is the Director of Community Engagement and Education at Cincinnati Opera. Tomer Zvulin, who's the General and Artistic Director at Atlanta Opera. All of these panelists will be led by Opera America's Board Chair and the General Director of Washington National Opera, Tim O'Leary. So Tim, I turn it over to you.
Mark, thank you so much. And hello, friends. It's wonderful to be gathered virtually with you all, especially in a year and a week that has been so emotionally raw. I wish that we could be together in person. And yet the silver lining of gathering virtually is how many of us are gathered. I think there are 1,200 of us logged on today, many more than for an in-person conference. And I'd like to say thank you for making time to be with us today. And thank you to this extraordinary panel for volunteering to discuss today's important subject. I don't know about you, but when I listened to Adrian Ellis's insightful remarks, I found myself both energized and horrified by his diagnosis of the increasing likelihood of massive exogenous change. Last week, during our panel discussion, though, I found myself tremendously hopeful because of the colleagues that we have in this field who are making change. I found last week's discussion uncomfortable in the right ways, candid and helpful, I believe, towards the title of today's discussion, Making Change. Now, I bet many of you have the same view I do about the following dichotomy. On the one hand, opera, as the combination of words and music and theater, is one of humanity's greatest inventions, and it has untold potential to speak the truth about what connects us through expressions of our deepest hopes, fears, and sources of pain. At the same time, opera, the traditions of the opera world in which we find ourselves working, these traditions represent in the minds of so many people the exact opposite of what any of us would wish to be associated with. I mean, exclusion and cultural hegemony, and unfortunately, racism and sexism. Many of us, I think, have joined this profession precisely because we are guided by a belief that the power of the art could be harnessed to overcome the power of those associations as part of an effort to change the larger systems of racism and sexism and exclusion in our society. So let me turn to a panel of people who are doing just that. All colleagues I admire deeply. They're each going to give us the traditional 3-minute Gettysburg Address length overview of their approach to making change. How do we dismantle what exists? How do we change ourselves? How do we change our systems? Annie Burridge, please take it away.
Thanks, Tim. I too was really inspired and somewhat terrified by Adrian's remarks on Monday, but they truly were brilliant. I kept hitting rewind and taking copious notes, except for the section on locusts. I didn't need to spend more time with the locusts, but Adrian talked through what he termed the 7 well-known long trending challenges our sector faces. And he then went on to say that the future of our organizations, however, will be shaped by challenges that present themselves in abrupt, non-incremental ways, discrete events that are sudden and out of control. I've been the general director of Austin Opera for 3 years, and I can easily think of 3 such events during my tenure, the most recent being this past Sunday, when I woke up to a message from an artist agent on the East Coast saying, "You need to get on your social media channels now." The night before, a member of the Austin Symphony and the Austin Opera Orchestra had posted numerous racist comments online. And by the time I woke up, those comments had been reshared more than 1,000 times. Thousands of messages of outrage were pouring into the inboxes and social media sites of the opera and our colleagues at the symphony, and thus began a 12-hour sprint to condemn the language and work with the American Federation of Musicians to separate our institutions from the source of this online hate speech that clearly violated our values, our mission, and obviously our harassment policies. Amongst the thousands of things posted online about all this, Stanford Thompson, who's the founder of Play on Philly, a leader I have such immense respect for, he rightfully pointed out that firing a racist or issuing statements of solidarity isn't the same as having established practices of equity and inclusion. And that is absolutely true. And my organization has been sprinting to try and catch up with the leaders in our field. In this regard, we were so grateful when last year Minnesota Opera extended an invitation to us to be part of a consortium of 5 opera companies engaged in a 3-year project to develop best-in-class diversity, equity, and inclusion practices that could and will hopefully serve as a model to the field when we're done our work. And this work, as you all know, begins with a lot of listening and internal training. Our board retreat this winter was dedicated solely to the topic of diversity and why it matters. And just gaining an insightful understanding of what bias is was a real step for a lot of stakeholders. And so, while we're all still processing the events of this past week, my initial thoughts are that they may force a real reckoning for many of our organizations that have been incrementally inching our way through this work. I certainly feel more emboldened as a youngish leader to be direct, and that there is no gray when it comes to the subject of racial injustice. You are either on the right side of this or you're on the wrong side of this. And we can certainly provide opportunities for people to get on the right side of this. I've seen remarkable progress come from just one conversation. But the point is, this isn't a long game anymore, right? The game has been long enough. I also think these recent events are a real gut check for those of us in leadership positions that have been relying on what I would call crutch motivations to nudge our organization in the right direction. And by that, I mean, allowing some of our more reluctant stakeholders to think that the reason for this work is more butts and seats. We can eliminate some of the friction along the path toward getting our organizations where they need to be. But, both me and Simon and Teresa Worth Howard on last week's panel made it quite clear that the time is now to have very direct conversations with our stakeholders about our real motivations for this work and about our responsibilities as cultural anchor institutions in a community.
Annie, thank you so much. We're going to keep it moving because we've got a big, fabulous panel. So we're going to hear now from Tomer in Atlanta.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your remarks, Annie. I'd like to start by offering sympathy and concern to all our colleagues right now. It's been an incredibly difficult few weeks, and we have suffered incredible losses. I specifically want to send our condolences to the family of Maestro Joel Revzin and the Arizona Opera family. Joel passed away a few weeks ago from COVID-19, and along with him, we are grieving for so many other losses from this virus. And at the same time, we've been thrown into another crisis, which is reckoning with institutional racism in America and all the many emotions that are attached to it. And so again, I just want to offer support to all the colleagues and all the friends that are on this call and are in the industry that are suffering job losses, that are worried about their loved ones that have lost somebody. Now, this was originally, as Mark said, was supposed to be a discussion about organizational change, which I'm happy to talk about. And then it turned into, very interestingly, with the lens of what is going on in the world right now, into a discussion about how does EDI connected to change? How can we instigate change with EDI? And as I was contemplating this, it occurred to me that it all starts with leadership. Changes in organizations start with leadership. Changes with equity, diversity, and inclusion has to start with leadership. And if you think about leadership, there are two distinct, very different styles of leadership. One is fake it until you make it. I know exactly what I'm doing. Don't question me. I'm going right there. Follow me. It's going to be okay. So many leaders are following that. And why? Because so often we are thrown into positions where we have no clue how to lead people into safety. And the only way that we can get there is if we have conviction. But at the same time, there's great danger in that conviction. There's great danger in believing just in yourself and not listening to people around you. The other absolute opposite example of leadership is found in much older, wiser, more wise people. And that is connected to the idea of, I know that I know nothing. This is not a new idea that I came today with. This is Socrates 2,500 years ago, sparking some of the most important conversations about life and humanity. And so if I look at my personal leadership, when I arrived in Atlanta 7 years ago, I must admit, I was trained as a stage director. I was trained as a stage manager, as a medic, my instinct was to just go and try to get everybody to safety as soon as possible, as soon as I can. But as time goes by, you realize that along the way, if you don't listen, if you're not careful, you're going to alienate a lot of people. And so I'm coming to this from a very humble place. And I connected to the EDI, to the question that we're all contemplating right now. How do we survive the recent crisis? How do we survive this incredible situation that has unfolded? And the answer is that I have is that we know nothing. And for that reason, we need to be open to the advice and the perspectives of many other people. And I'd like to finish with a personal story. My grandfather was in the concentration camp in World War II. I grew up in Israel, and as a kid, I thought that I understood what racism is about, the dangers of anti-Semitism. But as time goes by, and when I put my two girls to sleep at night, and I think about a parallel universe where those little girls can be pinned down into a pavement and have a knee on their neck, sucking the life out of them just because of their religion, because of their race, because of their father, I'm horrified. And so I'm saying this from a point of view of, I know that I know nothing, but I know one thing, that a change must be coming. And I hope that today we can figure out how that change is going to come.
Tomer, thank you. We're going to keep going and hear from Quo Johnson. Quo.
Thank you for having me back. Excited. I want to start by saying that this work is different for those of us who have to live it, for those of us who do not have it as an option. This work feels different. So I always want to make sure that we're mindful and that we're holding space for those of us who are affected differently. I want to call our attention kind of to Monday, where what was meant to be an honest expression of solidarity for the Black community unintentionally, but very quickly dissolved into a frantic display of far too many white-centered, insulting, and what feels like empty commitments to dismantling racism from our field. We had other examples, but I'm speaking specifically to our field. And so in response to kind of recent revelations, if you will, many of our organizations are now committing to tackling racism. They put it in writing, tackling racism, and responding to a global pandemic all at the same time. So we have to understand that unless we change, right, within our organization and within our field, we will not achieve those goals. And we will fall back into this simple cycle in which we're using other people's experiences, the cries of other communities, to simply make a statement and then do nothing more. So I want us to kind of consider what it means to change and how we understand change, because so often we embrace change, but how often do we have to be dragged kicking and screaming just to consider a new idea or a new environment? Imagine what that looks like for many of our leaders, many of our patrons, much of our field who are so used to being the dominant focus of this once we start to do different things. So I want us to make sure that we are honest and that we understand that our practices are part of the problem, because many of them are rooted in cultural norms of supremacy, of the right to comfort, of exclusion, of power hoarding, the list goes on, right? And so it is not enough for us to just embrace or adopt new business practices and fold it into what we're already doing. We must purge ourselves of the traditions and the harmful biases that rob us of opportunity. So we have to be honest and we have to ask the hard questions. It's a matter of whether or not we are fit to navigate this change. Do we need to become more? Are our leaders fit to navigate this change? Do we have the courage and the creativity to envision a completely different way of creating opera that requires the internal work in all of our organizations truth so that we can create that inclusive environment that we've been seeking for so long. Thank you.
Quo, thank you. We're going to go on to somebody I've known for since he was in high school, and it makes me feel very old that he's now such an accomplished member of our field, Derrell.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Opera America, for facilitating this space. I yield the first minute of my remarks to a moment of silence for Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Thank you. We must say their names. I am so excited for this discussion, especially hearing from my colleagues here, all of whom are so fabulous and so well respected, as well as the questions and comments from those who are watching. I think when it comes down to making institutional changes within our organizations, it's quite simple if you're doing it for the right reasons. I feel like so frequently, too frequently, what we're looking to do is to correct our optics, to win grants, to gather new audience members. I think when we are able to disabuse ourselves of those goals and instead focus on love and justice and what that looks like and how it trickles into opera, then all of the necessary steps will become a lot clearer. I'm going to center my remarks around three things. Since there's so many of us, I figure if I give three takeaways that might help folks. The first is making time. If you make the time to truly understand what EDI is, we talk about equity so frequently, and I can promise you about 60 to 70% of us don't really understand what equity is, what makes it different from equality, for example, and how it is an ongoing process with goals we will never reach, and we have to be comfortable with that. To my white colleagues, I will ask you to make the time to actually look within yourselves, look within your organizations, look within your interactions and your relationships with Black people specifically, and also other people of color. You'll notice throughout my remarks and throughout all of my speech, I will talk about Black people specifically because I think people of color has become so problematic and we are in need of specificity. The second thing I think we can do is making space. You know, this was something that was able to peek through at several moments during last week's discussion around belonging. But I think one of the biggest things that needs to happen in this industry is that there need to be more Black people at the top in leadership positions. There are so many subjects in opera that are being produced right now on Black subjects, and yet there are no Black artistic directors of any major opera companies. There's one Black general director, and it's not okay. And again, this POC title allows us to say, okay, well, we do have some POCs in positions of power. Yes, but whose stories are being told the most frequently and who is around the table of production? That is something that it belongs in the bucket of equity, and we're not properly attending to it. And then the last one is making change. This is probably going to be the most difficult for many of us because it means changes not only within our organizations, but also change within ourselves, within our mindsets, within why we are doing the things we are doing. There are many people who hear these kinds of conversations and say, well, if people don't like what we're doing, then they should do something else. There have been people who have told me, well, if you don't like how the opera industry is run, then maybe you should start your own opera company. If that's your first thought when people start talking about racial justice and equality and equity in this work, then there is a huge mindset shift that needs to happen. And I think now that we have this space, if we can just assume that each of us has something within us, probably more than one thing, that needs to be reconsidered, needs to be explored more deeply, needs assistance, whether that comes from your colleagues of the same race, religion, ethnicity, or from folks from different groups. We need to be willing to seek those resources and have the courage to do so. Thank you.
Darrell, thank you. We're going to move along and hear from Aubrey. Aubrey.
Hi, everybody. To me, change means we need to stop talking only and start doing. So I'm going to use the next 3 minutes to very quickly talk through 5 things our organizations can start doing right now. The first is put numbered goals on casting. This is my opinion only, maybe not representative of everybody on the panel, but I think in the same way we assign numbered goals to fundraising, to ticket sales, to KPI metrics for our website, we could absolutely assign number goals to our casting. If we live in a community that's, for example, say 15% Black, say we will commit to minimally hiring 15% Black singers on our stage next season. Number 2, reconsider our hiring practices for our offstage talent as well. We have a huge opportunity ahead of us as organizations. Right now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, as we know. So many of us have furloughed staff, laid people off, but that time will come to an end. And the opportunity that lies ahead is to rebuild in a different way than how we did before. So how do we do that? The first is that research shows, and this is for every hiring manager listening right now, research shows that those first round applicant pools make a huge difference. And that's also where a lot of people meaning underrepresented groups, do not make the cut. So what do? Instead, research shows that in our first round candidate pools, if we can make sure that we have a more diverse pool, more people will go through the ranks as it would be in an interview process. And I have to add that having one only, research shows, makes it more unlikely that that person will advance to the hiring round. So we've got to make sure as hiring managers that first round applicant pool make the list, make the cut, and then look at that. And we can only infer so much from names, but we can commit to say, if that looks like a bunch of white Karens and Michaels, let's go back to the list and say, okay, who else can we add to this that, yeah, they're worthy of a first round phone screen at least, and make it multiple types of people so that we're not practicing tokenism. Number 3, commit as a board that for every one qualified white male that we will vet, recruit, and bring onto our board, we will also vet and recruit a talented female and a talented person of color, or any other minority, transgender, non-binary, any other underrepresented person. Make those commitments. And it's okay to say that we know this is a challenge. Why is it a challenge? Because as human beings, our tendency is that our personal Rolodex, our mental Rolodex, thinks of people like us. That's why it's challenging to identify different people to bring in to our orbits. So to name that is okay. And to name that and say, we see that challenge and we will meet that challenge. And we believe the talent is out there. And we will vet and recruit talented people of all kinds, all colors to join our board. Number 4, we can use our place of privilege to stand up for others. This is something that is applicable no matter your level of seniority or role within the organization. When you're in a meeting and somebody from an underrepresented group keeps getting interrupted, research says this happens all the time, you can be the one as a white person to speak up and say, you know, I really want to hear what so-and-so is saying. Can we just go back to that and let them finish that idea? We can be colleagues that promote kindness in our workspaces and help lift up the others who need the space that they deserve. Number 5, lastly, we can reframe diversity from something that is messy, as we so often describe EDI work, reframe it from something that is messy to a business opportunity. I think there is no shame in saying that diverse teams perform better, and research shows that time and again. Research shows that diverse teams make better decisions because there are more ideas and varied ideas brought to the forefront. And similarly, research shows that diverse teams help bring more and varied viewpoints on why something is not a good idea. So I'll leave us with no hostility in this statement, but for anybody who can think this week of an arts organization that said something that really could have been vetted by a Black person, it shows that our senior staffs are lacking and there is a void and a huge opportunity to bring people into conversations because we need those viewpoints in our staffs. Thank you.
Aubrey, thank you. We're going to move right to Tracy. Tracy, please.
Hello. As one of the first and few African-American women in the world of opera, I have seen a lot of racism over the years, relative to the world, relative to my community, relative in my field of opera, and really, to be frankly, a lot of ignorance. Within every organization, there is a collection of individuals. I would suggest, and it's telling, for each individual within that organization to search your heart. Because if your heart is not right, and if you are not willing to take the steps to make change, we're at a loss from the beginning, at the top. And that's no matter who it is within the organization. It's also important to listen and learn. There are some amazing, fascinating people in the world, whether they're African-American, Latina, Asian, Caucasian, gay, straight, whatever. There are so many fascinating people in the world. I've always had the desire to listen and learn about all kinds of people. I'm just purely fascinated by differences. I equate my Rolodex to a bag of jelly beans. You never know who I'm going to end up talking to, and it feels good to be able to dig into that bag and to pull from those resources. I think it's important for every organization to not only write a mission statement relative to DEI, but to really develop a strategy and then to execute it. It should be part of your daily life. It shouldn't be something that's put on the shelf when you decide you want to do a production or a program relative to African-American or Latino communities. And then the other thing is not to be afraid, be fearless. If you feel like as a Caucasian person in your organization, there's some injustices happening, don't be afraid to speak up, step up, speak out, call people under the carpet if they're not doing or saying the right thing. I see a lot of people who know it's wrong, but are afraid to say something about it, who are afraid to say something to their artistic director or their CEO or their colleagues to say, you know, that's not right. Okay, so be fearless and okay with speaking up. Okay, you know, it's interesting. It's kind of funny if you look at it in this way. You know, the earth is brown, and that's where all of our life comes from. That's where our plants come from. You know, that's where essences of life, things that we use to survive. So it just kills me that for some folks to stand next to a brown person turns their stomachs. I don't understand that. I don't understand that we can't see the beauty in every person for who they are. So we do have a lot of work to do within the organizations, and I give a lot of credit to those organizations, including my own, who are trying to make a change and really putting some effort into it. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we have to be comfortable with shaking things up, with uprooting the status quo. You know, it's funny how we tend to do things as organizations, especially nonprofits, because we're always dependent on the funds of those who have more, who have wealth. But sometimes those people aren't the best people. For me, it makes no sense to fight and scratch and accept funds from entities who are either racist, mean, and nasty. And I'm not saying everyone, but if those funders or those other people within your organization or in your life cause you stress and so much stress in order to receive what they have to offer, then sometimes you need to step away. So if those people are not on board with engaging in diverse communities, that should tell you something. If those funders have a problem with people of color, and they're very vocal because they're very vocal in their white circles. So keep that in mind when we're making decisions on who we partner with in the community. And if our partners aren't on board with being a collective and diverse community, then we need to know to step away. That's all I have to say.
Tracy, thank you. We're going to keep going and hear from Michael. Michael. Oh, Michael, you're on mute. All
I
right.
was going to say thank you, everyone. This is an amazing group, and Tracy, you're a hard, tough act to follow. Just want to say there's no such thing as neutrality in discussions of oppression. Silence and inaction is complicity. And just listening to my colleagues, there's no us and them in a way for us to find a way forward. There's only us, and we are diverse. The other thing, and this is just to repeat what other people have said, and I know this is one of the easiest things, people of color in positions of power, women in positions of power make change easier. My mother had a frame with a quote on her wall. You probably know it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Courage to change the things I can. That's the one that stuck out to me. We have to do the work. I'm saying we, the people in positions of power, and it's now, and it's also going to be the long game. And I think, this is opera. Let's be honest about that. But opera is also art that can improve the human condition in its best form. Mozart, Puccini, Verdi were actually dramatic agents of change within their art form. They were aligned with political movements. They also had run-ins with those in power. We can't any longer say that opera, historically or currently, exists outside of the fabrics of our cities and our cities' communities. And we need the courage to change things so that our art engages with an inclusive idea of community. I love Opera America. My very first Opera America, I discovered that the statistics on audience attendance over 2 decades and their regular declining rates year by year by year. And you have to compare this to the cities in North America that have been growing in population and wealth year by year by year. What are we not doing right? And I think there's something to deal with right now that's really important, but this is also the long game. This is an opportunity. So I think beyond the art, it also is this fact that our rich and diverse potential of future leaders, artists, and audiences, if we don't reach more people, if we don't reach our entire community, is going to be impacted, and change is required. Our countries are diverse, our cities are diverse, but the majority of the resources are focused on repertoire, leaders, artists, and a way of operating that is exclusive to race and gender. So I wanted to share a few examples of things that have been impacted by policy and by collective action. In 2015 in Seattle, a cyclist advocacy group changed their language to say people on bikes and people driving, because they found that cyclists and drivers were becoming polarized. Language is important. Our Prime Minister in Canada, Justin Trudeau, started talking about immigrants as new Canadians, not as separate from who we are. We are all Canadians. They're just newer. Our Canada Council for the Arts unveiled funding that was tied directly to diversity. All organizations must demonstrate, and I quote, a commitment to reflecting through your activities, membership, and organizational makeup the diversity of your geographic community or region. It's important to note that we're not doing it on our own in a critical enough mass, and that leadership and policy and collective action is required. The most important thing that opera, that art can do, is improve the human condition. We need the courage to change the things we can. Music will heal us, theater can teach us, voices are best heard. Let our courageous change be to think of our art as one that can do everything we love, and also normalize people as humans first. Open the circle of who we think of as we. Raise up stories that more can call their own, and give voice and power to those of us who haven't been heard. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Now we're going to move on to Khori. Khori.
Thank you all. I'm so changed for bearing witness to what you all are sharing. I want to thank you for that. And I want to just own up front that I'm 6 months in my job. So being in a position of power is a new feeling for me. But what I see and what I'm craving is leadership from our government, it's the shocking abdication of leadership that is making what we are facing so incredibly difficult. And that the consequences of that abdication of leadership is what's playing out in every city. So I'm speaking now to myself and not to anyone else, and for myself, that my plan is to take responsibility for the power that I have, and to hold myself accountable, because I am the general director of a company and I am responsible for the way we spend our money. And that's what I want to talk about for the next couple minutes, is the budget. Change is like gravity. It just is. It's health and it happens. And good luck to anyone out there who's trying to stop it, especially now. So change is the default. It is institutions and systems that thwart change and that thwart what is natural and eradicate health. And that takes effort, which is good news. It takes systems of oppression and secrecy and shame and blame, and all of those systems have to be learned and upheld and maintained. And what we as leaders can do is look at what we are actually prioritizing, and that is the budget. The budget is a core reflection of our values. It is a statement of institutional priorities. The way things are at our institutions can be tied directly to the choices that have been made by leadership, and the budget reflects the institutional priorities. Things are the way we have made them. So often we let ourselves off the hook by crying poor because there's not enough money for this or there's not enough money for that. And we create a culture of sort of martyrdom and self-sacrifice. And guess what happens when people's needs aren't being met? They resist surrendering further. They take as compensation other things like projects and the way this has been and the way that has been, and they begin to internalize them as their compensation to exchange for what the company has taken for them. And that adopts a culture of clutching and grasping. So what can we as leaders shift in what we are incentivizing? These are the moments that create that opportunity for us to plainly see what we have been doing to stand in our own way. And it's amazing how a clarifying event can just rob us of the disillusion that we've been struggling with for so many years. Right now we see in Asia, contact tracing is not a problem. It is up and running. It is a priority for that culture. In Europe, we are seeing organizations begin to perform and solve problems around the Bundesliga is playing soccer, opera halls are becoming, we in America are making other choices. We're making choices around mitigating litigation. We're making choices around protecting our institution, our private freedoms and individual freedoms. And those are fine choices to make, perhaps. Other choices we make to uphold white supremacy are maybe not so fine. But to pretend that this is just the way it is and that it's an impossible problem to solve it's to abdicate leadership. So I'm hoping that in my own institution and in other institutions, we can start to think about taking ownership for the choices that we've made. I'll give you an example or two from Opera San Jose. Fewer than 50% of the homes in San Jose will you hear English as a primary language. If you come to Opera San Jose, the super titles are available only in English. So that is a choice. That's a choice the company has made. We have off the bat cut our customer base in half. 46% of families in the community of San Jose could come engage with our programming, but the rest of people really wouldn't be able to participate. Pay equity. The minute I set a salary for a staff member, if it is 55% less than what they need to live in the city of San Jose or in Silicon Valley, then I'm restricting myself to people who come from wealth or family money in order to, work in an arts organization like ours. Or I'm asking people to sacrifice their own needs and the needs of their family at the altar of opera as an art form, as if just being able to work in service of opera is, worthy of you get some medal. And then we wonder, how is there a culture of martyrdom? So I can go on and on and on with what companies might be actively choosing, whether it's a stacked org chart where isolated departments jockey for the same pool of limited resources, whether it's a board of directors with no term limits, whether it's a marketing strategy focused on direct mail, whether it's a mandate for hiring that people have experience and knowledge of operatic repertoire, all of those things are choices and they have consequences. So I'm here to be a new leader that is transparent in grappling with this complicated, wicked problem, as Adrian would say, telling the truth and being healed through that truth, asking those on my team to make those decisions with me so that we can all own the choices that we're making as an institution and as an organization. Those of you familiar with Cotter's theory of change know that step one is about manufacturing urgency. We don't have to do that anymore. There is a global pandemic that is urgent. You know, George Floyd was murdered. These things, that the hardest part of manufacturing the urgency has been taken out of our court and done for us. So opera's disrupted, the budget's out the window. Are we going to squander this opportunity to reset? I certainly hope not. The way we make it and the choices we make now, that's the way it will be. That will be our legacy, and that will be the future of opera.
Khori, thank you. After each one of these sets of remarks, I've resisted the urge to like just cheer and yell, "Way to go!" This is an incredible group of people, and it's causing me to have hope. Now, I'm going to ask Adrian to say a word or two after he gave us that horrifying vision of what to expect exogenously. But before he does, I'm going to actually quote Adrian, because I had the pleasure of working once with Adrian as a consultant, and he said something to me that I'll never forget about a strategic planning process, which is it's better to get the people involved to spend more time rolling around in the solutions than rolling around in the problems. And so we have been naming all of the problems. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to take a moment while Adrian is speaking, because I'd like to spend the rest of the discussion rolling around in specific actions and solutions. And many of you have named several. And by the way, I'm sure there's lots of great questions appearing through the chat, and Opera America is going to feed them to us as well. The question I want to begin with after Adrian says a word or two, we've named various areas of change that we need to see occur. Changing the management structure, changing me, changing the boards of directors and their priorities and behaviors. Derrell said something very important, I think, was that what's the reason we do any of this? And he mentioned the crutch solutions, right? But if the reason we do all of this is love and justice and contribution to healing the world, then it should influence how the board behaves and thinks. One of the most vexing challenges in the arts is changing the behavior of the people who support us, changing the audience, changing the donors. Nina Simon gave us a great piece of vocabulary about what to say to somebody who believes that that person has the right to control the whole space, you know, of the museum or the lobby. Khori asked us about changing the budget as a reflection of our priorities. So I'd like to ask the panelists to think about a specific example, something where you've seen one of these changes occur, where leadership did the right thing, or where you were a part of making that change. Or did you see something that should have occurred and didn't, and what would you have done? All right, so let's see if we can roll around in solutions. And let's first hear from Adrian. Adrian, try not to scare us all off the call.
I won't scare you, and I should tell my fellow panelists that they don't have very long because I'm going to be very brief. I don't want to take up valuable airtime of this conversation. In the presentation I made earlier this week, I talked a lot about wicked problems, real complexity, and the difficulty of untangling those layers of complexity. And I managed somehow to get UFOs in there along with everything else. But in other words, the world's a complicated place. But we can't use that complexity as pretext. It's context, not pretext. And I think that there are, for people on my side of the Great White Way, as it were, there are questions of personal morality, personal responsibility, that complexity of situation can become pretext for. In other words, that at some level, at some existential level, issues of personal morality, personal responsibility become incredibly important. And we have skin in the game, and we have power positions to lose. And so I do think that, you know, I'm sure you all read Tim Snyder's book on the rise of fascism. I'm sure that we're all aware of, you know, the challenges that face us. The challenges now are partly about wicked problems and all the complexity I talked about, but we cannot get away from the fact that they are also questions of personal morality. It's not, in that case, what one does, but whether one has the courage to do it. So I just wanted to underscore that, because I think it came through in what a lot of people have said, and I very, very strongly concur with it.
Adrian, thank you. So panelists, I hope you like my multiple choice of changing the power structure, the management teams, or the attitudes thereof, changing the board or the behaviors thereof, the priorities thereof, changing the budget, or changing the audience. Who's got an example? Actually, I'm going to call on Derrell. You're relatively young in the field in administration. But so tell us a change you have seen or should have seen.
At Long Beach Opera with Jenny Rivera, who is, you know, as many of us know, so thoughtful on these efforts. So I've seen many changes. One is actually the construction of position. Last year, I was the manager of education and community engagement, and Jenny recognizing, you know, that I had much more to offer to the organization, and wanting me to have more direct contact with the board, as well as more flexibility in terms of how I construct my schedule, in reference actually to something Khori was talking about, which was so fabulous in terms of, you know, well, am I doing this because this is my career and like this is what's sustaining me, or am I doing this for some, you know, feigned dedication to opera, and you know, I think putting me into this new position and creating something that had never existed before in the company, it told both, first of all, the industry that this work is important for our organization, and secondly, I think it sent a message to me, you know, from my leader, that I was valued and that my work was valued. I was out the flexibility that I need to get done what I need to get done.
Haha, I've unmuted. Darrell, thank you. I'm going to call on people, but I asked the panel to jump in when they have something to say. But I'm going to call on Annie to tell us a change that you know of or have been a part of in one of those categories that's towards the ends that we're talking about, a more just field with greater equity.
I mean, I will say broadly that, as I said in my comments, I have seen remarkable progress in individuals. I have seen individuals change their understanding of what these systemic issues are rapidly through engaged conversation. It has really far exceeded my expectations for the development of humanity. And I've seen that happen, you know, with my stakeholders here in Texas, in a way that's quite heartening. I would just say the one thing I've responded to, and I can't remember if it was Quo or Tracy who mentioned like the importance of getting help with this work and admitting when you need help and you don't have the tools in the toolbox to facilitate this type of work on your own. You know, that's certainly the case with me. We work with an amazing consultant here at Austin Opera, Joelle Allen, who runs Interaction Traction in Minneapolis. And that's who we flew in for our board retreat this year. And it's just so incredibly helpful to, meaningfully engage paid professionals in this area of work. That's been the most effective for me so far.
Tracy, unless anyone else is jumping in, I'm calling on you. You described a lot of the problems that we've seen. What have you seen that has changed? how should it have changed?
Well, I think for us, I think for us at Cincinnati Opera, I mean, to have a staff that is truly growing and diverse is really great. I can remember years and years and years being the only person of color. Now, currently, for our small administrative staff, we have 6 people of color, which is a huge, big deal. So, but it is because there has been a true effort on the behalf of our leadership to do just that, to diversify our staff and realizing and understanding that there are a multitude of talents and that it's a value to the company and it doesn't take away from anyone else at the company, but it's definitely a value to have more diverse minds and voices within the company. The other thing that we have done in the last couple of years in terms of our commissioning works that are composed and written by African Americans, 2 of which were supposed to premiere, of course, this season, 2020 for our 100th anniversary, but one of which was a piece called Fierce with William Minifield and Castor and Patience, along with Tracy K. Smith and Greg Spears. So we are thinking about that and thinking about who we're working with. I think our artistic team has been very diligent about engaging artists of color and being very intentional. And that's the key thing, being intentional. And it can't be, we did it this year and okay, we'll take a break next year. It has to be a regular part of our planning cycle, is to be conscious and thinking about that. So, and it does. And it also means, and I agree, connecting with folks. If you don't know it, we don't know the answers to everything. And so you have to ask questions. And so you have to make connections and build relationships and talk to people. And it's okay to do so. If you don't know, I would much rather you say, hey, I don't know, how do we go about this? And then we start the process of learning and giving you the resources that you need to make it effective work. So.
Tracy, thank you. Okay, I'm hearing, examples of a staff leader doing the right thing, examples of the hiring practices, changing the composition of staff, artistic choices about what we commission, getting the right tools and help specific examples. It sounds to me like some of these are the easier things, right? We're picking the low-hanging fruit here. So I'm going to turn to Quo. You have in your title, company culture manager. I'm going to make somebody company culture manager at my company. It's a brilliant title. Tell me about, well, what's the, of that multiple choice, what's a change that you have seen or should have seen?
So as company culture manager, a lot of it is looking at the culture of the organization, right? We have our mission, but looking at how we complete our mission. So many of the changes that I've seen that are slow, it's a lot of the relationship building. It's a lot of education, kind of self-education, education as a whole, so that we get to the point where we stop making excuses. At the end of the day, that's what we're facing. We want to make excuses and we want to make sure that we are centering inclusion. We are centering the understanding that as leaders, so as our leaders at the Dallas Opera come into this work, they do so not from a position of power, but from a position as a student, as someone who is learning, as someone who is wanting to support. That also ties into what we commit to doing for our policies, what we commit to doing for our budget. Because if we are going to say that we are prioritizing ensuring that we get to a vast pool of applicants, then that means that we have to make sacrifices. And what it looks like when we decide to kind of forego certain things so that we can support the work we're wanting to do. So much of the company kind of culture piece of my role with the Dallas Opera is making sure that we view things through a lens of equity, and then we do so through humility and honesty. And again, the work is not quick. Real conversations happen in space so we can have those discussions, and then so that we can build on the conversations that we've already had. But again, it's also a matter of leadership, ensuring that they are envisioning an opera that does not look exactly like them. So many of our leaders want me as a consultant, or they want others as consultants so that they themselves can be, better qualified to continue leading. And that's still part of the issue. So we're making sure that as we are creating opera, that we're co-creating and doing so from a fluid position within the opera companies.
Quo, I can't resist asking you a follow-up question, but before I do, I'm going to ask the panel, okay, these are all excellent examples. The hard one is the board, right? And we have to always be careful at Opera America that we don't turn these panels into just complaining about boards of directors. Boards of directors are volunteers who support us and make possible what we do. But boards of directors are the people who choose the leaders in our field, right? And we have all had experiences of seeing the right kinds of change occur at the board level. We've all had experiences of being very discouraged by the kinds of dynamics that we can see at the board level. So I want to ask you to name a time when you've seen the right change or should have seen the right change. But Quo, I'm going to just ask one follow-up question, which is, so you mentioned, centering equity in the conversation, right? Opera companies that have had historically white staffs, et cetera, can be a well-meaning but really, boneheaded group at times. And so I just wonder, like, Nina Simon gave us that great example of like a vocabulary to use to say, like, this is not a space that you can control for yourself, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, without, calling out your colleagues in Dallas, et cetera, can you tell us an example of a time where you actually had to make a change or influence a change and how you were successful in doing so?
And looking at how the organization, how we all communicate with one another. And then in implementing workshops and sessions in which I facilitate, where we are beginning to face what it means to be in Dallas, what it means to be on stolen land in Dallas, what it means to be on land that belonged to others at different points in time. So that is part of the change that is happening now. I will also speak to what it means to kind of begin to do the work with the board, because again, like, the board is the board. But it's a matter of how we include board members within our committees and within our different committees, and then how those board members begin to kind of start that spark that extends to others. That's the work we're trying to do when we are doing racial equity and racial healing work. We're wanting to make sure that we work with those who want to work with us, and then how that extends to others.
Cool, thank you very much. An inspiring set of examples, and your general outlook about it all is very hopeful and inspiring. And so, okay, who's got an answer for the board for a time that you've seen the board actually change, yours or somebody else's, or a time you should have, and what you should have done about it? Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of comment on the fact that there are thousands and thousands of interesting people who would be amazing on opera boards. In fact, the top 3 earning households in North America are no longer white households. And there's a little bit of a thing between the chicken and the egg. If a company proves that it's valuable and current in the way that let's say a larger group of us think is valuable and current, then people will see it desirable to be on that board. So I feel like you can demonstrate your value to your community, and you will attract the board members that you want if you are understanding this conversation and if you are taking action on this conversation. So maybe you can reach those people who would come in being like, well, I think this is a traditionally exclusive club and I'm not sure that I belong here. But if you can show that you're not that, you can attract so many more people. And that's the thing, there's thousands and thousands of them.
Who else has something to say about changing the board? Derrell.
I have something. I'm going to first make a comment and then move into my response to that question. And it's an invitation for all of us, not only in this discussion, but also in all of the industry. If we can decenter whiteness as leadership, I feel like that's something it's so ingrained in how we speak, that oftentimes anytime we talk about, the leadership of a company or board of a company, although in many cases those people happen to be white, the more we repeat that language, the more it becomes ingrained within us. That's the way it's supposed to be. And I, as someone who believes that actually one of the most substantial changes that can be made in the industry is just something that's not happening on any level substantive, being people of color, Black people specifically taking on leadership positions and these boards becoming more actively diversified, it's not happening. And I think part of that is, is okay with this sense of like, okay, well, they're there, well, we're just going to provide them with the tools of how to better diversify or better engage with equity. And I'm saying that that's absolutely a great solution to part of the problem, but the other part of the problem has to be the space for other people. And so that leads me to my response. I think, you know, as far as I can, and I've been in interaction with many companies, both as a performer, as an administrator, as a consultant, I'm just not seeing a lot of active work being done to diversify boards, not anything that is courageous. The best example I can find, and I don't even know, you know, how successful it became. I haven't followed up with her, but it's from a colleague of mine, Piper Gunnarsson of On-Site Opera in New York City, who told me in a conversation that, you know, there were two board prospects that she had, and I think it was a husband and a wife. And Piper, if you're here watching in the comments, please correct me if I'm mistelling this. And it was a husband and a wife, and I think one of them was of color and one of them was not of color. And she wanted both of them to join the board, but at that current moment, she was only going to take on one, and then the other one would be in the next cycle. And so she had to sit down with them and say, I am specifically choosing this person. I'm choosing this part of the spousal unit because that person is of color and that's what we need. And she said she refused to have any more white people join the board until she could counteract each of those additions with someone of color. And I think that kind of activity and intention is something that is absolutely needed, and it's just not happening frequently enough.
Well, I'd like to add to that, because one of the challenges also is that when you do engage board members of color, whether African American, Latino, or whatever, the challenge is they always get stuck on either the community engagement or education committee. You know, we have people of color who are bankers, who could be on the finance committee. You know, we've not yet had an African American board president. And I think, unfortunately, when we do get board members of colors, they're underutilized. Their skills are not, and they're not really engaged in the context of board meetings or other company functions where white board members are. There's this clique, there's this unit. And so board members of color are not feeling like they are accepted or belong in that group.
Moving from diversity to true inclusion on the board, I totally agree, Tracy. And one of the things that I believe about our job as professional staff is it's our job to lead the boards. The boards are, you know, we report to the boards, but it's our job to lead a board. And it's one of the trickiest balancing acts in our challenging job descriptions. I know Mark Skorka has a question from the chat about the board issue. Mark.
Well, Tim, thank you. And several of the comments have responded in part to the question. And that is, if we talk about the problem as being our boards, aren't company general directors in a way abdicating their own responsibility to speak truth to power if they say it's the board? And then how does one take that on if the board members are the most important steady contributors to the company? Because there was a question too about the intersection of power hoarding and funding, but also this question about abdicating the moral responsibility because it's the board. So how to navigate that very, very difficult space in a nonprofit structure.
All right, now we're getting some really great hard questions. I like that. And because I'm the moderator, I don't have to answer. So I'm going to call on my colleagues who are general directors. Let's start with Tomer, who hasn't said anything yet. So Tomer, are you abdicating your responsibility relative to communicating with the board? How do you take on the responsibility?
So, you know, when you run an opera company, you have so many constituents, from your senior managers to your staff, to your public, to your board members. And it's a great responsibility. And when one expresses opinions, one has to be very careful about creating consensus and making sure that what we say is carefully thought through. I think that we live in extremely sensitive times, and we need to make sure that we engage in conversation before we click post, before we talk too loudly. We need to think before we rush. Now, I also wanted to mention one more thing, which has to do with boards, with making the board more diverse. I think, and I'm not an expert, I think that one of the ways to get people more interested in an opera company is to reflect the city in a more wide way through what you program on stage. If you have an opera company that does a year after year, Tosca, Barber of Seville, and Marriage of Figaro, because we have to do the top 10, you are losing the possibility, other than casting in a diverse way, you are losing the possibility of reflecting that city. And there are many opera companies that have become much more relevant because they are diversifying what they put on stage. And many examples exist, from Long Beach Opera programming Central Park 5 to UTIM programming Blue. There's a great piece by Joel Thompson, 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. But it goes beyond just African-American programming, because you can, and you should, think about the Hispanic community. We are thinking about the veteran community, the Jewish community. And what we found out from the moment that we started diversifying the programming is that there is more interest in people coming to see our shows because they see people like them on stage and with issues that they're grappling with. And so if I have a choice to be on a board of directors, and I have so many organizations I can choose to be and spend my time, talent, and treasure, why would I belong to an organization that doesn't reflect me? So the answer has to be with what you put on stage first and foremost, so that you can get those people interested. But then again, I'm saying this, and I realize that I live in a city that has 50%. And when you look at the public, when you look at my board of directors, when you look at my staff, we're nowhere close to representing that. And culpa mia, but I have to say one more thing, it's an industry problem. This is a virtual forum, right? There's 1,200 people here. If this was an Opera America conference and you looked around, you would see very low diversity. Why? I think we need to represent more stories and more diverse stories. But I, again, am open to many, many perspectives because I don't know anything.
Tomer, I love it. You don't know anything, but it's your responsibility. You're a general director, so you're making it happen through what you put on stage. I'm going to turn to Khori. You're 6 months in the job. You have a board of directors. You have to be very
I just want to, as a follow-up to what Tomer said, I would say we also have the opportunity to look to those canon of works. And even though it feels like there is one way to present those, there are other ways to give ownership to different groups. You know, we're reimagining Figaro in colonial India, and that's very much driven by my story of my one mother from Indonesia and my father from India. This is my heritage. This is, you know, so we are able to partner with Sangam Arts, a local group, and they are going to be injecting Kathak dance. And we are giving Figaro to a new group of shareholders because it never belonged to one person to begin with. You know, an art form cannot be, you know, I really reject this idea that opera is problematic. Opera is not problematic. The way that we have presented opera is problematic. The customs we have assumed are problematic. And it is not necessarily required for every opera company to be able to bring in-house every piece of expertise or leadership or thought that we need to do this art. The art form is a collaboration of every art form at once. And I view my role in artistic matchmaking as an opportunity to lift up other organizations that are organically growing in my community, give them a platform, give them a paycheck, yes, perhaps, and give them ownership over a piece of this art form. So they might find a new mode of expression for their storytelling in what we do. As far as the board, you know, I don't have any magic answers there, but I do think that it is an abdication of leadership and very tempting as a GD to hide behind the board says this and the board says that. There's no magic rule that all the money you raise comes from the board. That's also mythology. If you want to see a project through and you believe it's exactly what's right for your organization, you go out and find the money. And the more that you do that, and the more that you diversify the perspectives in your own ear as a leader, the more you will see other people step up to the plate and share that burden. And the first step is always hardest. Once an organization is in sort of all bets are off mode, amazingly beautiful things to start to happen. So it's just that step of releasing what we have known to allow for what's possible. So that's all I add.
I'm a moderator, not a panelist, but I'm going to agree with Khori and say I actually think you can raise more money from the board when you lead the board towards the reason that we do what we do isn't just art for art's sake, but it's to heal the world and make the world more just. Board members, I find, are much more interested in supporting that financially, but it does lead to the harder conversations. Aubrey, I wonder if you have Khori didn't have a magic answer. Do you have a magic answer? And then I'm going to turn to a question that Mark has from the chat.
It's not magic, but I'll chime in two things. One is, Tim, you already said this, is that for the chief executive, managing up to the board is part of the job and it is a skill set. And in your words, it's incredibly challenging. And many people know me from my last job, executive director of the California Symphony. And so I've been in that executive role, and it's very different than any other setup where you don't have just one supervisor, you have a group of them, but the board chair is your day-to-day contact. And yet this group of people that is governing all of this, they're not trained to manage an opera company or an orchestra or a museum. And so there's this just very weird set of circumstance around all of that. And then within that, as the leader, yes, it's our job to cast a vision and bring all those people along with us and hopefully in partnership with the board chair. So just acknowledging what you said earlier, Tim, that I don't want us to gloss over that. Abdicating is not the way to go, and to do it right is truly a skill of leadership. The second thing I just wanted to chime in, if I may, is to say that also this isn't always the opportunity before us, but when looking at taking another job, that's the time to speak your values as a candidate and find that alignment. And I'll just say, when I was looking for my next role after California Symphony, the more we talked about courage so much already, the more I was courageous to say, no, let me stake my claim and what I believe and what I want to see for this organization and this board. And it's very clear very quickly who aligns with that and who doesn't, which makes, as a candidate, very clear to know like what's possible at that organization. And so I just want to encourage everybody, as we make future decisions on who will our employers be, we get to choose as employees which board we want to work with. And that's
that is good.
Power we can claim.
There's a lot of people who are listening today who will themselves be interviewed by a board search committee someday. And I agree with you. That's the time to say, if you want somebody to do X, that is not me. If you want someone to do Y, I will do it. I actually once talked myself out of a job by saying that to a board search committee. All right, I want to hear from Annie, because I know Annie's had real experience making change on the board. And then I'm going to come to Mark's question from the chat. So Annie, very briefly, how do you fulfill the responsibility to lead the board?
I mean, I would just point out, that every step I've led my organization through in terms of improvement and equity and social change. Let's say, for example, the eradication of sexual harassment in the workplace. With every step I've taken there have been calls for my firing. It is difficult work to navigate successfully. That being said, there's a big difference between being fearful of losing your job because you're doing the right thing and being fearful of leaving your house and going on a jog. And that's what I acknowledge, and that's why this work matters. And I don't. I remember in one quite difficult time, I said to my husband, I'm like, why can't I just keep my mouth shut and keep my head down? This would be so much easier, but I never do. And he said, Annie, like, that's not who you are. That's, that's just the way that's going to go. And that's the job. And we get paid to do that job.
Annie, thank you for that excellent observation. Mark has a question from the chat. So Mark, come on in, please.
And this is an artistic question, and it came fairly early in the chat, and it stopped me in my tracks. So we talk about new works that speak to an African-American experience, and there are a number of them that have been even cited in this conversation. But the question was about whether, you know, the white producers are commissioning works about the African-American experience for a white audience, or whether the works are actually for a Black audience and speaking in a different language, a different take on the same story or a different story. So this question of whether the works that we are creating that we think will appeal to, say, an African-American audience, are they really just being written for a white audience? I was stopped in my tracks by that question, and Tim, I pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, are we commissioning new, forgive me for saying it, are we commissioning new Porgy and Bess examples, right? So I'll just say, like, as a commissioner, I've always believed the way to commission is to ask the artist, what do you want to write? And to me, that's the simplest answer to that question. But who's got an answer? There has been a massive, well, on the relative scale, infusion of work on African-American stories in the last 2 years. But who's got an answer? Are we truly commissioning work that is for the Black audience?
My question to that is, did you ask Black people? You want to know if it's for Black audience, did you ask Black people if they wanted to see that? Or if we wanted to see that? And so often the kind of default with our leaders, well, with our current leaders in opera, is that, you know, we know what is best, and this is what, you know, we would love to see. This is the art, this is the great art. And the fact that we do not have enough in our own circle to ask, right? Similar to all of the statements that came out this week. We don't have enough people in our circle to ask because we are still centering ourselves. When I say we, this is the big we. Our white leaders are still centering themselves in the decision-making. So if we want to know whether or not we have enough art, or if we're commissioning things that is for a particular community, ask that community, involve the community in the process, involve Black people in the process, talk to more than just the 1, 2, 3, 4 Black people you have working for your organization, because that's not enough. Place yourself within other communities so you can see what is valued, because there is an issue and there is a difference. Art that is for white, majority white audiences, and then art that is for other communities. There are certain stories that we know all too well, and we can tell them better. We don't want to hear them, or we do want to hear them. We want to hear them a certain way, and you don't get to decide when and how that happens. So it's just a matter of, again, kind of centering that within our culture of, I do not know, let me go and ask. I do not know, let me have the humility to give space. And then what that looks like learning together, because I assure you, once we have a greater variety, not to knock any of our composers who are creating amazing work and amazing stories, but once we have a greater variety, you will have a greater appreciation for other cultures, and as opposed to just the stories that speak to you, the stories that, you know, your good old kind of opera goers just love and it's their favorite. You'll find that as we can tell more than one story about a community, about Black people in particular, we'll stay on that, that we will have a greater understanding of why we are where we are, and then what steps we need to take to go forward.
I'll quote, okay. Oh, Tracy, I was just going to call on you. Go for it.
So hang on a second. My apologies. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I am right in line with Quo. The greater challenge is creating. So a lot of companies like to commission things that they feel are African-American stories, but they're usually some story that is tragic, poor Black people, and it makes white folks feel good. And, you know, I'm a proponent for, like, if we never do Porgy again, because I hear so many white folks saying, it's my favorite opera. Why is it your favorite opera? You know, granted, there's good music in it, but usually I hear, because I think the story is so true to the African-American experience. That is insane. I hear that more than you can imagine. And I get it. Unfortunately, that's the one opera that an African-American artist is probably guaranteed to get a gig, but that shouldn't be the case either. And you know, it's funny because we just talked to a number of our cast members last year after our season, our Porgy cast members, and had this very same conversation about what the next African-American opera related story should be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something from history or a true story or something derived from that. There are so many, Aida wasn't a true story, okay? But there are more stories out there that can be told and should be written about and for and by people of color, you know, because we can tell our stories. We can tell our stories, and it shouldn't be something that, you know, an artistic director dreams up and thinks, oh, this will be great. I mean, there are tons of stories out there, whether it's about Jewish people or whatever. And, you know, it's interesting. And if it is something that is historical, you know, I mean, take for example, Nkuru Okoye's Harriet Tubman. That story was a different story of Harriet Tubman. It wasn't the traditional, here's the lady that got us through the Underground Railroad thing. I mean, it talks about her family, her relationship with her family. I mean, we as African Americans, we come from families. We have deep and amazing stories and very positive stories. All of our stories are not tragic. We persevere in spite of everything that's happened to us over history over the past 400 years. So I think it's important that if you are truly going to commission or engage a story about African Americans, I agree with Quo. You need to talk to the community, even beyond outside those African Americans that you have on your team, and really get to know the community, get deep, get in with them, and you'll learn what's important. Someone asked me from another organization, they said, I don't understand, you know, we've been trying to partner with this Black community, and they don't want to have anything to do with us. I mean, they're not responding to what we want to do. And I had to share with them, do you realize what's happening in the community right now? At this particular time, there's a soccer stadium being built in the midst of their community. People are losing their homes. You are not their priority. So you need to find out what their priorities are and work from there.
Tracy, thank you. Michael wanted to get in, and I should say, as a point of order, we're over our original time, but I got a permission thing from Opera America that said we can extend. So we're going into overtime, and if you're tuning in, I hope you'll forgive us because it's an important discussion. Michael, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just on a very structural, in a very structural way, if we have subscription series that fill up 80% of our houses, there is no space for new communities to come in if something else is programmed. It's just taking a different approach. I'm a huge advocate for medium and small venues because you can have a longer run, and word of mouth is how longer runs work. You can then actually build up new audiences that can be attracted by something. So built into the structure, if you're a subscription-based company and you program a person of color creator who's done a story about people of color, and there's no space for them to buy tickets, or there's just really, you know, 1,000 seats for sale total and in a 10,000 seat capacity, that's one of the things that is making this for the audience that's already there, which isn't an audience of people of color.
Michael, thank you. I'll just quickly tell a story of when I, to Annie's point about, you know, the fear of losing your job for doing the right thing is, you know, a relatively low kind of fear to have to worry about in the environment that we're talking about. But when Jim Robinson and I commissioned a champion from Terrence Blanchard, we said to him, what do you want to write? And he took like 6 months to come back with an answer. And then he came back with the answer. And if you know the story of Champion, you know it's an incredible story, but not like what you normally find in an opera subscription brochure. And so we immediately said, yes, let's commission that opera. And then I spent the next 3 years thinking, well, if I get fired for this one, this will be a great way to go down. I've never told that story, but I figured to tell it to 1,200 people. Darrell, you were in the opera. So I wanted to see if you would touch on the question of are we commissioning works for white audiences instead of having the courage? And then we've only got a few more minutes left. So I want to ask you all what's giving you hope as we look ahead to making the kind of change that we have to have the courage to make. But Derrell, why don't you touch this subject first?
Sure. I've had to switch to my phone. I apologize. So I hope you can hear me okay. I, as those who are close to me know, have a huge problem with the ubiquity of white producers of subjects of operas on Black subjects. I think is highly problematic. I think the same way that we can reach out to different organizations in our community to as consultants, we can easily reach out into the industry, outside of our industry, into the film industry, into musical theater, into straight theater, to find Black producers of these works. Because what happens when you're already producing and presenting to an audience that is predominantly white, and then you have a white producer, and then you use this opera on a subject, and it is specific case, it's not only Black operas. I think any opera, that is current and is meant to tell the story of some specific culture, I really do feel that people of that culture need to be actively involved in how it's produced. They need to be paid for how they're contributing to the effort, and they need to be the folks on whom we depend in making the tough decisions. Because only then do we get anything that is authentically from that culture. Otherwise, it becomes whitewashed, whether the audience knows it or not.
That is a beautiful answer. Thank you. All right, so who's got an answer for what's giving you hope? We have hard work to do. We have smart people. We have systemic problems that we ourselves are the responsible parties for having created in part. So what is giving you hope that we can overcome and that we can actually fulfill the commitments that we're making through a discussion like this one?
I'll go. I think this is giving me hope. I mean, the first call I got from Mark Skorka months ago was, we want to do this conference session on change. And then fast forward a couple weeks, months, oh, now there's a global pandemic. It's going to be an online conference. And then yesterday, Aubrey, you can only be on this panel if you're ready to talk about actual change, not theoretical change. And I was like, man, put me in, I'm here. So I thought that was awesome. And then Tim, I just got to say, to have a board chair say in front of all of these people, we need action, this is what we have to do, we need that. So just I'm hopeful that there are other board chairs who think like you. So that's my hope.
Okay, who's got something else nice to say about me? No, I'm only kidding. No, seriously, thank you, but we have to be held accountable, and so that is the commitment that we're making. So who else has something that's giving them hope?
I'll go. I went into the shelter in place not really craving opera. Seen enough of it. If I had a night off, there were 10,000 other things I'd rather do. Wow, I missed it. I've really missed it. And I've heard from patrons and donors and artists that look like our country, that look like 2020, that reflect our communities as they really are, that they are missing art and they are missing what we do. And it had felt in Silicon Valley like what we were trying to sell, just there were no buyers and we were trying to push a boulder uphill. And I think these moments of incredible pain and bring people together, and there is a collective acknowledgement right now that what we do is an essential service, and that is giving me hope, not maybe for the next 6 weeks or the next 6 months even, but what we do needs to be done, and I know that now. I'm also incredibly inspired by the innovation around what artists and opera creatives are coming up with during this pandemic. And I think all of that incredible work we never probably would have gotten to in different circumstances. And those solutions will engine a stronger future for the art form. So that gives me a lot of hope as well.
Khori, I can't help jumping in because Doug McLennan the other week said this thing about, well, our delivery system for making opera is totally broken, but guess what? It wasn't working that well in the first place anyway. So now we have a chance to reimagine it. And that gave me a lot of hope, although it's not going to be easy. Who else is feeling hopeful? Oh, you unmute.
I'm super hopeful about,
Michael.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, can
Go
you
for it.
hear me? I think I'm super hopeful about opera and how we can move forward we've been programming diverse creators for the last 5 years and seeing 30% year-to-year audience growth. We've been working with diverse creators that don't work with necessarily full scores or Western score notation, and learning so much about how different art forms can inform our practice and how the sound of our world actually belongs to many more people than the Western classical world, and how that can enrich and inform our rooted in Western classical art form. So I see this as opening up all of the possibilities for art, for opera to become vital again. And that the key is in unlocking the potential of this diverse, awesome group of artists that we have in this continent.
Who else? Who else has hope?
I am hopeful that while the true revolution will not be televised, we will see it on social media. We've been seeing it on social media. I am hopeful that we will not go back to the old normal, because we don't need to. As we have these conversations, I have hope because we have a lot of people who are doing a lot of internal work. Again, this should not be an option. Someone's life should not be an option. Someone's livelihood should not be an option. So as our current leaders, and as we create more diverse leaders, as we go through this process, I have hope because we'll start to consider what it means to extend a hand to someone as a friend, as opposed to being a savior or being an opera expert, and what that means as we create art together.
Oh, thank you. Just picking up on what some of you have alluded to, one of the things that gives me hope, because I've experienced it in my own organization, is that we've moved as a culture from the idea of diversity to the idea of inclusion to the idea of equity. And I agree with what Derrell said. What everyone needs to do is make sure they understand the difference between equality and equity and all of that. But then the vocabulary and the commitments it entails of anti-racism is a much different activity. And I've felt my own organization begin to take on that exact responsibility of being an anti-racist organization. And that is giving me hope. That's the only way I believe that we'll get where we're going. Who wants to have the last word?
Well, I don't want to necessarily be the last word, but I do want to say something on the subject of hope. I'm going to say what makes me hopeful, and then a very deep hope of mine. So what makes me hopeful is, one, the Me Too movement and how the opera industry responded to it, how a lot of people were confused at first about what was going on, but as the information became apparent, we were very active in our response, and I think we can even go further. But my heart imagines, what if we were to have a similar response to the microaggressions as relate to race in some sort of a movement in opera? And I think if you really think about what that would look like, it would be atrocious. And I think that's commentary on how far we have to go. And the second thing that I want to say is a hope of mine. I'm going to say 3 very, very quick anecdotes. The first is, I was once pulled over by a highway patrol officer. And he came to my car and he said, okay, you are going really fast there. You can either get out of the car and I'll beat your ASS, or I'll give you a ticket. Which one do you choose? So that's experience number 1. Experience number 2 is, I am going into a panel discussion with people from the industry, headhunters looking for general directors, executive directors, all of these sorts of folks. And I ask a question about, which resources do you guys have to make sure you're approaching these searches with an equitable mindset? And one of them told me that my position, being one rooted in EDI, was the wrong position, that I should not be looking for a general director position. Only development directors should be looking for them, and only marketing directors should be looking for them. And the third is, when I was, as a singer, and I'm still a performer, I was auditioning for managers. And one of the managers, I sang several arias, and then I sang a spiritual. And she said, oh, wow, the spiritual. Yeah, I think that's what you should be doing. Like, you really understand that repertoire. Little does she know, I'm a specialist and a doctor of 19th century opera, but that's neither the case nor the point. And my hope is that for the Black people and probably other people of color watching this and listening to me, those three experiences and the microaggressive nature of each of them is probably very apparent. For other people, they probably seem like three discrete events that have nothing to do with each other. And I am hopeful that as we continue to unpack what racism looks like and what racist structures are, that we all come to realize how all of those experiences in my life are within one bucket of white supremacy, of bullying, and of a systemic problem that we have to approach and tackle.
Okay, I do have a comment. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Okay, I am hopeful that every opera company will do the work. It takes work, it takes resources. Again, I've heard people talk about putting it in your budget. There are a plethora of talented African-American artists out there. Put them to work. They're ready. Put them to work. We have a community that would be ready as well once they start to see people who look like them, not only on the stage, but in your administrative offices, on your board. I am hoping that in light of what we're seeing in the world now, in the community, things happen for a reason. This is a wake-up call for all of us. Now we have to pay attention and we have to put things into play, put things into action, and it has to be a daily process. And be willing to learn, be open to learn. None of us know all of the answers, but we have to work together to make a better community and to make a better world for all of us.
Tracy, thank
For
you.
those interested, Afton Battle is looking for a development job. Company should be begging Kenny Overton to be an artistic director. Chandler Johnson wants to get into artist representation. Those are just a few names to start with if you're looking for them.
I love it. All right, we are now 3 minutes over our overtime. We are into a second quarter hour of overtime, and we all know how that goes. So it's time to wrap it up. It's been a privilege for me to be part of this discussion. Opera America made certain commitments in a statement that we made today. We have all made commitments at this panel to doing work in our companies, and I want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you for your generosity of spirit and your candor and your courage. I'm going to turn it over with great gratitude to the whole Opera America staff, to the CEO, Mark Skorka.
Tim, thank you so much, and thanks for moderating this discussion. I echo my deep gratitude to the panel, to those panelists who allowed us to pivot in topic, to those panelists who joined us at the last minute to have a discussion that felt rooted in the day-to-day and not just in the theories of change as we'd originally intended. I want to say that this is the end of the session. It is the end of our conference, but it is only a step in the work that we're doing at Opera America and will continue to do. We have our IDEA Opera grants, our IDEA residencies, we have our civic practice grants, but there's more to come. We are working to achieve the progress from our perspective that we're able to achieve. So thank you for being with us for this session. Thank you for being with us for the conference, but stay with us for the progress we're working to achieve. I wanted to thank our major conference sponsors, Fisher Dax Associates, the Music Publishers Association, and Threshold Acoustics. And above all, I want to thank the Opera America staff, without whom none of this work would be possible, whose advice makes our work better, and whose hard work is dedicated to all of our members and artists and all opera stakeholders. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.